August 1944, Normandy. A field workshop of a German panzer division, somewhere behind the line, in an orchard with camouflage netting strung between the apple trees. If you were a Bergman, a recovery man, in the maintenance company of a panzer division, you had the least glamorous and most important job in the German army. Nobody wrote songs about you. Nobody photographed you for the newsreels. Your war was mud and cable and a winch, and the specific, hopeless arithmetic of trying to drag 32 tons of dead steel out of a ditch while somebody was shooting at you. And you had learned, by August of 1944, to recognize something that you were not supposed to be able to recognize. American tanks came back. Not new ones, not replacements off a ship, the same ones. A Sherman had a name painted on its hull. American crews did that. A girl's name, a hometown, a joke. It had a serial stenciled on it. It had markings for its battalion and its company. And a German gunner who had killed a Sherman in a hedgerow on Tuesday would sometimes find himself 10 days later looking through his optics at a Sherman with the same name painted on the side of it. He would assume he had misread it, or that the Americans, with their infinite factories, simply painted the same names on the new ones. The recovery men knew better, because the recovery men understood, in a way that a gunner never had to, what it actually takes to bring a dead tank back to life. Here is a figure that tells you the whole war, and it is not a figure about tanks. It is a figure about the vehicles that pick tanks up. Germany's purpose-built heavy armored recovery vehicle was called the Bergepanther. It was, like almost everything German, an excellent machine, a Panther hull with the turret removed, a spade at the rear, a heavy winch, and enough power to actually move a Panther or a Tiger. Across the entire Second World War, Germany built somewhere in the region of 340 of them. 340. For an army that fielded thousands of Panthers and Tigers and Panzer IVs across a front that ran from the Atlantic to the Volga. And when there was no Bergepanther, which was almost always, the recovery men had to improvise. To tow a Tiger, the official solution was 3 18-ton half-tracks, harnessed together like draft horses, 3 of them for one tank. The German manual explicitly forbade towing a Tiger with another Tiger, because doing so would destroy the final drive of the tank that was doing the towing. The crews did it anyway, constantly, because the choice was to wreck one tank in order to save another, or to lose both. Think about that as an engineering culture. An army so short of recovery equipment that its standard practice was to break one of its own tanks in the act of rescuing a different one. Now hold that against what the Americans were doing. German commanders looked at the Shermans coming back and reached the only conclusion their doctrine permitted. The Americans, they said, have unlimited production. They simply build more than we can destroy. It is a factory problem. It is arithmetic. There is nothing to learn here. They were wrong. It was not that the Americans built more tanks. They did build more tanks. But that is the boring half of the answer. And the Germans stopped at the boring half, and it cost them the campaign. The Americans had done something stranger and far more consequential. They had decided, years before the war, that a tank was not a weapon that gets destroyed. A tank was a weapon that gets repaired. This is not a story about armor, or about guns, or about whether the Panther could kill a Sherman at 2,000 meters. It could. That argument is over, and the Germans won it. This is a forensic audit of what happened after the Sherman was killed. And it is the story of how an army that lost the tank argument won the tank war, because it had understood something the Germans never did. That the question is not how hard a tank is to kill. The question is how hard it is to keep dead. Part 1. The German calculus. To understand the German recovery man's despair, you have to understand what he was actually being asked to fix. The Panther was one of the finest tanks ever built. That is not controversial. Sloped frontal armor that Allied guns struggled with. A 75mm high-velocity gun with a flat trajectory and superb optics, wide tracks, good cross-country performance. It was also, from the perspective of a man with a wrench and a mud-filled orchard and 4 hours of daylight left, close to a nightmare. Start with the final drive. The final drive is the last set of gears in the chain, the assembly that takes the power from the transmission and turns the drive sprocket that pulls the track. On a Panther, the final drives were a known, catastrophic, unsolvable weakness. They were under-engineered for the weight of the vehicle, and the steel they were made from was substitute steel, because the alloying elements Germany needed, the tungsten, the molybdenum, the nickel, came from places Germany did not control and could not reach. So they broke, constantly, not in combat, on the road, on a turn, under load. And to replace one, on a Panther, in the field, you had to get at the transmission housing at the front of the tank, which meant, in the standard procedure, lifting the turret off. Lifting the turret off a Panther, in an orchard, in Normandy, in August of 1944, with Allied fighter bombers overhead, looking for exactly the kind of crane you would need to do it. You did not do that in a field. You could not do it in a field, which meant the tank had to go rearward, to a depot, to a workshop with a gantry, sometimes onto a railway flat car, and back into Germany. And here is the cruelty of it. The tank could not drive rearward. Its final drive was broken. That is why it was going. So a recovery vehicle had to tow a 35 to 45-ton tank at walking pace on roads that were under air observation for tens or hundreds of kilometers, using fuel that did not exist, with a recovery vehicle that Germany had built 340 of. You can see the trap closing, can't you? Now add the second problem, and it is the one that historians of German industry have written about with something close to horror. German tank production changed constantly. The Wehrmacht and its designers were engineers of genuine brilliance, and they behaved the way brilliant engineers behave when nobody stops them. They improved things, continuously, mid-production. A Panther Ausführung D was not a Panther Ausführung A, and neither was a Panther Ausführung G. Turret designs changed, mantlets changed, gun mounts changed, cupolas changed, hull details changed, road wheels changed, which means that a spare part, sitting in a crate in a depot in France, might fit one Panther in the company and not the one next to it. A German maintenance officer therefore had to know not just what he was fixing, but which batch it came from, which factory built it, and which month it left the line. Now put yourself back in the orchard. You have a broken Panther. To fix it, you need a part. To get the part, you need to know the production batch. To get it to you, someone has to find it in a depot and move it on a road system being hunted from the air, using fuel that does not exist. Meanwhile, the front is moving. And so, over and over, in Normandy and afterwards, German crews and German recovery men made the only decision available to them. They blew the tank up themselves. There is a German word that appears again and again in the loss returns of 1944. Total Ausfall. Total write-off. And what makes those returns so devastating to read is how many of the total write-offs were not the work of an enemy gun at all. They were tanks that ran out of fuel, or threw a final drive, or bogged in a field, and could not be recovered, and so were destroyed by their own crews with a demolition charge and abandoned. Germany did not lose most of its armor in Normandy to Allied tanks. It lost an enormous proportion of it to the fact that it could not pick its own tanks back up. And there is one more thing about the Panther that the recovery men had to live with, and it is almost unbelievable when you first hear it. The Panther's road wheels were interleaved, overlapping, nested inside one another like the scales of a fish. It was a genuinely clever piece of engineering. It spread the vehicle's enormous weight across a wider footprint and gave the tank a smooth ride and superb flotation over soft ground. And it meant that to change a damaged road wheel in the inner rank, you had to remove the road wheels in front of it first, sometimes several, sometimes, depending on which one had been hit, most of a side. Now put that in Russia in winter. The interleaved wheels pack with mud. The mud freezes overnight. In the morning, the tank cannot move, because the wheels have been welded to each other by ice. Soviet crews learned to attack at dawn for exactly this reason. The German engineers who designed that suspension were not fools. They were solving a real problem, the ground pressure of a 45-ton vehicle, and they solved it elegantly, but they solved it in a drawing office, and the man who had to live with the solution was standing in a frozen field in East Prussia with a hammer, trying to break his own tank free of itself. This is the pattern, and once you see it in German armor, you cannot unsee it. Every one of these machines was optimized for the moment of contact, for the 800 meters, for the duel, for the shot. And every one of them made the other 99% of a tank's life harder. Because a tank does not spend its life in a duel. A tank spends its life being driven, and braking, and being fixed, and being driven again. Now walk into the German field workshop itself. A Panzer Division's maintenance company was chronically under strength. It had fewer heavy tools than it needed, fewer cranes than it needed, fewer trucks than it needed, and, after 1943, fewer trained men than it needed, because trained mechanics were being combed out and sent forward as infantry replacements. It worked at night, because in daylight the Jagdbombers were hunting, which meant it worked under blackout, with hooded lamps, in the rain, on frozen ground, on the most complicated machinery in Europe. And it worked against a clock that never stopped, because the front was always either advancing away from it or collapsing back onto it. A German recovery man in 1944 was, in the most literal sense, running a hospital during an evacuation, and he was running it with 340 ambulances for an entire continent. That is the German calculus. A superb tank that broke on its own, a repair that required a crane that could not be brought forward, a suspension that had to be dismantled to be fixed, a recovery vehicle that barely existed, a spare part that might not fit, and, at the end of the chain, a demolition charge, and a young man walking away from 45 tons of the finest engineering in Europe because there was no way on earth to bring it home. Now let us look at the tank the Germans laughed at. Part 2. The American answer. The M4 Sherman is the most argued about tank in history, and almost every argument about it is a bad one, because almost every argument about it asks the wrong question. The question people ask is, could it beat a Panther? The right question, the question the American Ordnance Department asked in 1941, is different. It is this: how fast can a man in a muddy field, in the dark, with hand tools, put this thing back together? And the answer they engineered into the machine is the reason the Sherman won. Take the front of the tank. On a Sherman, the transmission and the final drive sit in a housing bolted to the front of the hull. Bolted, not welded, not buried under a turret. A workshop crew could unbolt the entire front assembly of a Sherman and pull the transmission out forwards. The turret stays where it is. Now take the engine. The Sherman's power plant sits at the rear under a deck, and the deck comes off, and the engine comes out, and a trained ordnance crew could pull a Sherman's engine and drop a replacement in and have the tank running again in a matter of hours. Hours. Not a rail journey to Germany. Hours. Now take the running gear. The Sherman's suspension was built in bogie units, self-contained assemblies bolted to the side of the hull. Blow a bogie off with a mine and you do not repair a suspension. You unbolt the wreckage and you bolt a new one on. Every one of those design choices costs something. The bolted front housing is a weak point in armor terms. The tall hull that lets a man work inside it also makes a bigger target. The Sherman is a worse tank because of these decisions. The Americans made them anyway, deliberately, with their eyes open. Because the Ordnance Department was not designing a tank to win a duel, it was designing a tank to be resurrected, in a field, by a 19-year-old from Ohio with a socket set 400 times. And around that machine they built a system. The United States Army organized maintenance into echelons, 5 of them. First echelon was the crew itself, the men who lived in the tank, doing daily servicing. Second echelon was the unit's own maintenance section. Third echelon was the Ordnance Maintenance Company, attached to the combat formation, a mobile workshop that moved with the fighting. Fourth echelon was heavy maintenance, further back. Fifth echelon was the base depot, where a tank could be stripped to the frame and rebuilt. A damaged Sherman entered that system at whatever level it needed and came out the other end. And in the middle of it sat the machine that made the whole thing work, the M32 tank recovery vehicle, a Sherman hull with the turret replaced by a fixed superstructure, a heavy A-frame boom, and a winch that could pull 60,000 pounds. The critical thing about the M32 is not its specification. It is that it was a Sherman. Same hull, same engine, same suspension, same tracks, same spare parts, same fuel. It could go anywhere a Sherman could go, keep up with a Sherman column, and be fixed by the same mechanics with the same tools. The Germans built a recovery vehicle and produced 340 of them. The Americans took the tank they were already building thousands of, cut the turret off, bolted a crane on, and produced them in numbers that meant a recovery vehicle was simply always there. And then there is the doctrine that has no equivalent anywhere in the German army, and it has a name so blunt it is almost funny. Controlled cannibalization. The American Army wrote down, in official regulations, the procedure for taking a wrecked vehicle apart for the specific purpose of using its components to repair other vehicles. It was not a battlefield improvisation. It was not something a desperate sergeant invented. It was doctrine. It had forms. It had procedures. It had accountability. Understand what that means philosophically. To a German recovery man, a burned-out tank was a corpse, a tragedy, a total loss, total Ausfall. To an American ordnance company, a burned-out tank was inventory. That is the sentence that explains the entire armored campaign in the West after 1944, and almost nobody says it out loud. The Germans had a category called total write-off. The Americans had a category called parts. But where did that idea come from? Because it did not appear in 1942. Ideas like that are never new. They are old ideas that finally met a war big enough to need them. It came off the American factory floor. The United States had spent a century building an industrial culture around one obsession, and it was not quality, it was interchangeability. From the armories at Springfield in the 1800s, through the sewing machine, the bicycle, the reaper, and finally the motor car, American manufacturing had organized itself around a single idea. A part is not a hand-fitted object made by a craftsman for one machine. A part is a standardized unit that will fit every machine of its type, forever, made by a man who has never seen the machine it is going into. That is not a better philosophy than the German one. It is a different one, and it produces worse individual objects. A hand-fitted German gearbox, assembled by a Meister who has set every clearance himself, is a finer thing than an American gearbox that came off a line. But an army does not need a fine gearbox. An army needs a gearbox in Belgium, in the mud, at 2 in the morning, that a 19-year-old can bolt in without a Meister, and it needs 4,000 of them. So when the American Ordnance Department sat down to design a tank, they did not ask German questions. They asked automobile questions. How many men will have to work on this? Can we train them in weeks instead of years? Can this component be made by a factory that has never built a tank? And when it breaks, not if, when, how fast is it back in the fight? Out of those questions came a machine that a German tank officer, examining a captured one, would have found almost insultingly ordinary, and which he would not have understood at all. Now look at the men. The American Ordnance Branch was, in a way that has no German equivalent, an army of civilians. It was full of men who had spent their working lives in garages, in machine shops, in body shops, on farms fixing tractors and combines and pickup trucks. America, in 1941, was the most mechanically literate society on earth. There were more motor cars in the United States than in the rest of the world put together, and the men who drove them mostly fixed them themselves, on a Sunday, in a yard, with a set of wrenches. When the American Army needed tens of thousands of mechanics, it did not have to create them. It went and got them. The German Army, drawing on a society where a private motor car was a thing that belonged to somebody else, had to train its mechanics from nothing. And then, from 1943 onward, it had to comb the trained ones back out of the workshops and send them forward to die as riflemen, because there was nobody else left to send. And so the two systems diverged, and the divergence was completely invisible from a tank turret at 800 meters. On one side, a magnificent machine, tended by a shrinking priesthood of specialists who were being killed. On the other, a plain machine, tended by an ocean of people who had been fixing things their entire lives. Neither army ever fought the other over this. There was no battle for it. Nobody won a medal for it. It just decided everything. Part 3. The River of Steel. Now we have to talk about the thing behind the mechanics, because a system of 5 echelons and a doctrine of controlled cannibalization are worth precisely nothing if there is no part in the crate. The United States Army shipped spare parts to Europe in quantities that, when you first read the tonnages, look like a clerical error. Ordnance depots were established at Cherbourg, at Antwerp once the Scheldt was cleared, at Liège. Enormous facilities, filling up with crated engines, crated transmissions, crated final drives, crated bogies, crated tracks, road wheels, sprockets, idlers, gun tubes, radios, periscopes. And in those depots there were rebuild programs. Not repair, rebuild. Tanks were stripped to the hull, cleaned, inspected, reassembled with new or reconditioned components, painted, and pushed back out to the front as combat-ready vehicles. An American tank could die and be dragged rearward by a vehicle built on its own chassis and be taken apart in a depot in Belgium and be reassembled from parts taken out of other dead tanks and be issued back to a fighting battalion. And it did not matter which factory the parts had come from, or which month, or which production batch, because they fit. This is the thing that connects back to everything else. American industrial standardization was not a nice-to-have. It was the load-bearing wall of the entire system. Apart from any Sherman fits any Sherman. A mechanic does not need to check the production batch. A depot clerk does not need to sort the crates by factory. A recovery crew does not need to know anything about the tank it is dragging out of a ditch, except that it is a Sherman. And now put the numbers side by side, and hold them there. An American armored battalion in Northwest Europe was routinely operating with something like 85 to 90% of its tanks combat-ready on a given morning. German panzer formations, in the same period, were frequently operating at half that. A panzer regiment might report a third of its Panthers running, sometimes worse. The rest were not destroyed. They were in workshops. They were waiting for a final drive. They were sitting in an orchard under a net, waiting for a crane that was never going to come. 2 armies, 2 tanks, and the German tank was better. But on a given Tuesday in November of 1944, the American battalion was there, and the German battalion was not, because a tank is not a set of specifications. A tank is an attendance record. And the American Army had built, from the factory floor in Detroit to the mud of a Belgian orchard, a machine whose single overriding design goal was to keep turning up. There is one more piece of this, and it is the part that a German recovery man, if he had ever seen it, would have found genuinely obscene. The Americans could afford to be wasteful with recovery. If an M32 could not pull a Sherman out of a ditch, they sent 2 M32s. If the tank was too badly bogged, they sent a tank dozer to build a road to it. If the tank was in a minefield, they cleared the minefield. If the tank was under fire, they waited until dark and came back for it with a column. The recovery of a single tank could consume more machinery and more fuel than a German panzer company had at its disposal for a week's operations. And the Americans did it, over and over, all across France and Belgium and Germany, because they had run the arithmetic, and the arithmetic said the tank was worth it. Every Sherman recovered was a Sherman that did not have to be shipped across an ocean. Every hull rebuilt was a hull that did not have to be built. Every dead tank stripped for parts was a crate that did not have to be filled in Detroit and floated across the Atlantic. The Germans thought the Americans were replacing their losses. The Americans were recycling them, and I want to slow down on that, because there is an arithmetic buried inside it that is genuinely staggering, and almost nobody has ever run the numbers out loud. Every Sherman that fought in Europe had to be built in Detroit, or Lima, or Grand Blanc, moved by rail to a port, loaded onto a ship, floated 3,000 miles across an ocean that had U-boats in it, unloaded onto a dock, moved forward by rail and road, and issued to a battalion. That is a colossal cost. In steel, in labor, in shipping tonnage, in escort vessels, in fuel, in time, and above all in shipping tonnage, which was the single scarcest strategic resource the Western Allies possessed for the entire war. Every ton of shipping used for a tank was a ton not used for fuel, or food, or ammunition, or men. So when an American ordnance company crawled out into a shelled field at midnight to drag a burned Sherman back to a workshop, they were not being sentimental about a machine. They were saving a ship. A Sherman recovered in Belgium is a Sherman that does not have to cross the Atlantic. A transmission pulled out of a wreck and bolted into a running tank is a transmission that does not have to be built, crated, shipped, and hauled. A hull rebuilt at a depot in Liège is a hull that Detroit does not have to make. The Americans understood this in 1942, and they built the entire recovery system around it, and it is one of the great unsung strategic decisions of the war, because it meant that American combat power in Europe grew faster than American shipping did. Now look at what the same arithmetic did to the Germans, in reverse. Germany's tanks were built inside Germany. There was no ocean. The factories were, at most, a few hundred miles from the front. Recovery should have been easier for them, not harder. They had every geographical advantage, and they still could not do it. Because recovery is not a geography problem. It is an organization problem. It is a decision taken years in advance to spend money and steel and factory capacity on a machine that will never destroy anything. A machine whose entire purpose is to pick up other machines. Germany, presented with that choice, again and again, chose the gun. It chose the heavier tank, the bigger gun, the thicker armor, the next mark, the improved variant. It chose the thing that wins the duel at 800 meters. It chose magnificence, every single time, in a war that was never going to be decided at 800 meters. And the Americans, who had no romance about tanks at all, quietly built a fleet of turretless Shermans with cranes bolted on the top, and won. Part 4. The German Realization. In August of 1944, the German army in Normandy was destroyed. Not defeated, destroyed. The German 7th Army and the 5th Panzer Army were caught in a closing pocket around Falaise, and what happened in that pocket has been described by men who were there in terms that do not sound like military history. They sound like the end of the world. And what the Allied troops found, when they finally walked into the pocket, was not primarily a graveyard of tanks destroyed by Allied guns. It was a graveyard of tanks abandoned, Panthers standing in orchards, Tigers on their tracks in the road, Panzer IVs in ditches, assault guns nose down in craters, vehicle after vehicle after vehicle, undamaged or lightly damaged, out of fuel, thrown a track, broken a final drive, bogged in a field, and left because there was no recovery vehicle, no fuel to run one, no crane, no depot, no road, no time. Some had demolition charges set. Many did not, because in the end the crews did not even have time for that. The German armored force in the West did not primarily die under Allied fire. It sat down. Heinz Guderian, the man who more than any other invented the German armored arm, and who by 1944 was Inspector General of Armored Troops, had been fighting a war inside the German army about exactly this. He understood the maintenance problem. He understood the recovery problem. He understood that a tank in a workshop is not a tank. He pushed for standardization, for simplification, for fewer types, for more spares, for more recovery vehicles. He did not get them, not in the numbers required. Because Germany was an economy at the end of its rope, pretending to be an economy at the height of its powers, and because the men above him kept ordering new types, new upgrades, new marks, new heavier and more magnificent machines that required more of everything the Reich did not have. And so the German army arrived at a state that would have been unthinkable in 1940. The finest armored force in the world, equipped with the best tanks in the world, unable to keep half of them running, unable to recover the ones that stopped, and destroying its own vehicles by the hundred because it could not drag them home. There is a bitter, unanswerable arithmetic buried in this, and the German recovery men lived inside it every day. Every tank they blew up was a tank the Americans did not have to kill. Germany spent 4 years and an ocean of skilled labor and rare alloys building the most sophisticated armored vehicles on Earth, and then destroyed a great many of them with its own hands, in fields, in the rain, because it had never built the boring machine that picks them up. And then, 4 months later, they did it again. In December of 1944, in the Ardennes, Germany committed its last great armored reserve. And within days, the roads of the Losheim Gap and the Amblève Valley were choked with German vehicles. Not burning, most of them, but stopped. Broken down, bogged, out of fuel, jammed nose to tail in defiles, on single-track forest roads, where nothing could turn around and nothing could be pulled out. There were not enough recovery vehicles. There were never enough recovery vehicles. And in a traffic jam 30 kilometers long, on a forest road in December, a single broken-down Panther is not one tank lost. It is a wall. Everything behind it stops. And in that offensive, in those valleys, things that stopped in daylight did not start again, because there were American fighter bombers overhead. Now hold the two armies against each other on the same days, in the same weather, in the same forest. An American Sherman throws a track in the Ardennes in December. Within hours, a recovery vehicle built on the same chassis, running the same fuel, crewed by men with the same tools, hooks on and pulls it clear. It goes to a third echelon workshop in a barn 8 miles back. New track, new bogey, new final drive if it needs one, out of a crate. It is back with its company inside a week. A German Panther throws a final drive in the Ardennes in December. There is no Bergepanther, because there are 340 of them for the whole war. There is no fuel to run one if there were. Towing it with another Panther will destroy the towing tank. So the crew waits, and the front moves, and on the third day, an officer arrives and tells them what they already know. And a 19-year-old from Hanover sets a charge on the best tank in the world and walks away into the snow. That happened, in one form or another, thousands of times. It is not a footnote to the German defeat. It is a very large part of what the German defeat actually consisted of. If your father, your grandfather, or your uncle served in an ordnance maintenance company, in a tank recovery unit, in an armored maintenance battalion, or in any of the units who dragged dead tanks out of the mud and put them back together, I would be grateful to hear his name and his unit in the comments. Those men were never decorated for it. They are mostly gone now. What remains are the stories their families carry. Those stories belong in the record. Part 5. The Verdict. Spring 1945. Germany. The end. American ordnance officers moving through captured German territory were now walking into the workshops themselves, the depots, the rail sidings, and what they found, over and over, was Panthers. Rows of them, Tigers, Panzer IVs, some half-stripped, some complete, some sitting on flat cars that had never moved, tanks that had been sent rearward to be repaired and had reached the workshop and had then simply stopped, because the part never came, or the fuel never came, or the workshop was bombed, or the men who were going to fix it were sent to the front as infantry. Germany's tanks did not all die in battle. A great many of them died in the queue, and the American officers who cataloged them were, in a strange way, looking at their own doctrine reflected back at them in negative. Here was everything the Americans had built a system to prevent. The parts that did not fit, the repairs that needed a crane, the recovery that never came, the tank that was worth more than a Sherman, sitting in a shed, worth nothing at all. So here is the verdict. The Panther was a better tank than the Sherman. In armor, in gun, in optics, in the things that are measured in a duel at 800 meters, it was better, and the men who crewed Shermans knew it, and they said so, bitterly, for the rest of their lives. It did not matter. It did not matter, because a war is not a duel. A war is 4 years long, and it is fought across a continent, and over 4 years and a continent, the tank that matters is not the tank that wins the engagement. It is the tank that is standing there on the morning of the engagement. Germany built a tank that was very hard to kill. America built a tank that was very hard to keep dead. The Germans measured their armor in what it could destroy. The Americans measured theirs in how quickly it could be brought back. And when the whole thing was totaled up, across Normandy, across the Bulge, across the Rhine, the American number was the one that decided it. The Germans could afford magnificence. The Americans could afford resurrection. And in a war of that length, at that scale, against an enemy with an ocean behind him and a depot in every port, magnificence is not enough. It has never been enough. A weapon that cannot be repaired is not a weapon. It is a countdown. If this forensic audit gave you something to think about, hit the like button. It keeps this channel visible to the people who want the history the way it actually happened. Subscribe if you want the next audit, because there are more of these. More systems, more doctrines, more of the invisible, unglamorous machinery that decided who won. And remember this about the men in the ordnance companies. Nobody made a film about them. Nobody gave them a parade. They were the men who went out at night, into a field that had been a battle 6 hours earlier, with a winch and a cable and a boom, and dragged home a tank that somebody else was going to fight in tomorrow. They were not trying to be brave. They were trying to make sure that when the sun came up, there was something there for the boys to climb into. There always was. They deserved to be remembered by name, by unit, and by the work they did in the mud, in the dark, with the tools their country put into their hands.